What starts as a simple traffic stop quickly unravels into something far more sinister because these two officers didn't pull over just any driver. They pulled over the wrong woman. A black widow, calm as ice, sharper than steel, and with more power than they could ever imagine. They thought they were in control. They thought they could intimidate her. But what they didn't know, she's the mother of the most powerful man in town, and she's about to expose a system that's been broken for far too long. This isn't just about one arrest. It's about legacy, justice, and a reckoning years in the making. Stick around because this ending, you won't see it coming. Drop us a comment below. What time are you listening and where are you tuning in from? We'd love to know. It was just past 10 p.m. In Silver Creek, Oregon, a town where nothing ever seemed to happen, at least not on the surface. The streets were soaked in mist and silence. Street lamps buzzed softly above rows of trimmed hedges and picket fences, their yellow glow reflecting off the wet pavement like quiet warnings. This was the kind of neighborhood where porch lights clicked off by 9 and folks trusted each other to return a borrowed rake. But on this night, something was about to disturb that stillness. A grey Lincoln sedan made its way down Sycamore Lane. Behind the wheel sat Margaret Ellis, a 68-year-old black woman whose very presence radiated dignity. Her posture was upright, her hands steady on the wheel, even as grief swirled just beneath the surface. Margaret had just come from a candlelight vigil honouring her late husband, Robert. He'd passed 1 week ago to the day, 42 years of marriage, 3 grown children, and a lifetime of activism gone, just like that. Tonight was supposed to help her begin letting go, but loss doesn't obey calendars, and in the soft hush of her car's interior, Margaret could still hear his voice when the silence stretched too long. She wore a long grey wool coat over a navy dress, the same one she'd worn to the funeral. Her pearl earrings gleamed gently with each flicker of the passing streetlights. Her hair, white as snow, was swept into a simple bun. Margaret had the grace of a woman who had taught Sunday school, led food drives, and never once lost her temper in public, not even when people gave her reason to. As she turned down Cottonwood Drive, a pair of headlights emerged in her rearview mirror. Close. A police SUV, Margaret noticed. Of course she did. You don't live nearly 7 decades as a black woman in America and not know when you're being watched. She told herself it was nothing, just a patrol car heading the same way. No reason to jump to conclusions. Still, her grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. She took the next turn, then another. The SUV stayed with her. By the 3rd turn, it was no longer a coincidence. Her heart rate ticked up. Not fear exactly, but something older, familiar. She switched on her hazard lights and gently eased the Lincoln to the curb beneath a flickering street lamp. The SUV pulled in behind her. Its red and blue strobes lit up the neighborhood like a crime scene from a TV show. Inside her car, Margaret moved slowly, carefully. She reached into her purse, retrieved her wallet and registration, and placed them both on the passenger seat where they were clearly visible. Then she folded her hands in her lap, her breathing steady, her back straight. She had done nothing wrong, but that had never guaranteed her safety. The patrol SUV's door slammed shut. Heavy boots crunched against damp concrete. A flashlight beam cut through the night, dancing across the trunk of her car, then her back window, then a voice, sharp, clipped, lacking any human warmth. "Driver, roll down your window." Margaret complied. The officer approached quickly, white, mid-30s, blonde ponytail, sharp jaw, hard stare. Officer Haley Dunn. In Silver Creek, her reputation preceded her. Young, ambitious, and known for her zero-tolerance approach to anything that didn't look like it belonged. Her flashlight aimed straight at Margaret's face. License and registration. Margaret pointed to the items already waiting on the seat. They're right there, officer. Haley didn't reach for them right away. She stared at Margaret a beat too long. What brings you to this neighborhood tonight? I live here, Margaret replied. Her voice calm but steady. 2 blocks over, just heading home from the vigil. Haley narrowed her eyes. A vigil? For my husband, Margaret said. He passed last week. There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation behind the flashlight. Then, these Georgia plates. When did you move here? 3 months ago, Margaret said, to be near my son. Another pause. Then came the shift. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Margaret blinked. Is there a reason for that? Haley's voice sharpened. A.M. Step out of the car now. And just like that, the night changed. From quiet to confrontation, from grief to danger. And just down the street, behind a porch railing, a retired firefighter named Jim Hartley looked up from his evening tea. He saw the lights, the posture, the tone, and he knew. He picked up his phone, opened the camera, and hit record. Because sometimes history doesn't knock, it kicks the door open. Officer Haley Dunn stood tall, but her stance was anything but calm. Her hand hovered near her holster, the other still gripping the flashlight that beamed directly into Margaret Ellis's eyes. There was no good evening. No. How can I help you? Just pure suspicion wrapped in a badge and uniform. Margaret slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, careful not to move too quickly. At her age, sudden movement wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be dangerous, especially with an officer like this staring her down. As she opened the door and stepped out, the cool air wrapped around her like a second warning. Hands where I can see them! Haley barked, her voice louder than it needed to be. The fog around them carried the sound, made it sharper, more menacing. Margaret complied, lifting her arms slightly as if to say, Look at me. I'm no threat. I'm a grandmother, a widow, a woman who's been to more town hall meetings than she can count. But Haley wasn't interested in who Margaret was. She was looking for a reason. Any reason. Haley circled the car slowly, her eyes scanning every inch like a predator searching for weakness. Where were you headed again? I told you, Margaret said, her voice composed. Home. 2 blocks over. Haley stopped, staring hard. And why didn't you pull over sooner? Margaret's jaw clenched. I wasn't aware I needed to. You followed me. I stopped as soon as your lights went on. You were swerving, Haley said coldly, casually rewriting reality. I was not. It's my word against yours, the officer said flatly. And just like that, Margaret understood exactly what this was. It wasn't about a traffic stop. It wasn't even about her car. This was about control power. And Haley Dunn was determined to show it. Haley moved closer. Too close. The flashlight now aimed squarely at Margaret's chest. Do you have anything in the car I should know about? Drugs, alcohol, weapons? Margaret raised an eyebrow. No, officer. Haley reached for her radio, pressing the button. Dispatch? I'm on Sycamore and Cottonwood with a grey Lincoln. Female driver. Out-of-state plates. Claims she lives nearby. Requesting backup. Margaret's head tilted ever so slightly. Backup? For what? Is there a problem, officer? She asked, her tone polite but edged with disbelief. Haley turned back, her expression hardened. We'll see. Keep your hands visible. Margaret stood silently beside her car, under the flickering light. Her breath clouded in the cold air, but her eyes remained sharp. She was tired, but not weak, and she was not about to be intimidated into silence. Inside the house across the street, retired firefighter Jim Hartley leaned against his window frame, holding his phone like a lifeline. He had a bad feeling. Not just because of what he saw, but because of what he'd seen before. Decades on the force had taught him when something was off, and tonight, everything about this felt off. Minutes passed. Then another squad car rolled onto the street. Officer Ray Collins stepped out. He was older, in his 50s, with a grey moustache and a beer belly under his bulletproof vest. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded at Haley, walked over and said, "What do we got?" Haley didn't take her eyes off Margaret. Suspicious behaviour. Out-of-state plates. She got cagey when I asked her to step out. Margaret said nothing because she knew exactly how this would be framed. Officer Collins turned to her. "Ma'am, do you have any objection to us searching your vehicle?" "I do," she said without hesitation. "I haven't done anything wrong, and you have no cause." Haley smirked. "We can get a warrant." Margaret looked her dead in the eyes. "Then do." Haley walked over and leaned in close. "You know, people like you always think you're better than the rules." "People like me?" Margaret repeated slowly. "You mean people who know their rights?" Haley's nostrils flared. "I'm going to need you to place your hands on the hood of the vehicle." "For what?" Margaret asked. "You're being detained for suspicion of obstruction." Jim Hartley cursed under his breath. "Here we go," he muttered, hitting record again as Haley grabbed Margaret's arm and turned her toward the car. Margaret didn't resist, but her body stiffened as the cold metal pressed against her palms. "I'm not under arrest," she said firmly. "Not yet," Haley muttered. The cuffs clicked shut with a sharp finality that echoed through the empty street. Margaret winced, not from the pain, but from the familiarity, from the weariness of knowing that even now, in this town, in this century, dignity meant nothing when someone didn't want to see it. But she didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't beg, because she knew what her silence meant. She knew who she was, and she knew, even if they didn't yet, that this moment would not end the way Officer Haley Dunn thought it would. She had buried a husband, raised a mare, fought for change when others were too afraid to speak. This would not break her. No, this was only the beginning. Margaret Ellis stood there, handcuffed beside her own car, as Officer Haley Dunn turned back to the second cruiser with a smirk. The red and blue light still flashed in the foggy night, bouncing off the windows of the sleeping homes around them. Somewhere behind a curtain, someone was probably watching. But no one came outside. The second officer, Ray Collins, scratched his chin and looked at Margaret. He wasn't sure what to make of her. She didn't look dangerous. Hell, she looked like someone who brought homemade banana bread to city council meetings. But Haley was already in motion, and in this department, questioning her meant trouble. Haley had friends in high places, people who saw her as tough in all the ways that mattered. Collins looked down at his boots and said nothing. "Let's take her in," Haley said. "I'll drive." "What's the charge?" he asked, more out of habit than challenge. "Obstruction, possible false identification. We'll sort it out at the station." He didn't argue, just gave a nod and turned away, as if washing his hands of it. Haley opened the back door of her cruiser and motioned for Margaret to get in. "Watch your head." Margaret didn't speak. She just sat down, slowly, with as much dignity as the cuffs and the cold metal seat would allow. As the door shut, the sound was final, like the slamming of a cell door on something much older than the night, something generational. Back inside his house, Jim Hartley put his phone down for a second. His hands were shaking. The video he'd taken, it wasn't long, but it was damning. It showed Margaret, calm and compliant, being handled like a criminal. And it showed Haley, forceful and impatient. Jim had lived in Silver Creek his whole life. He'd seen the neighborhood change, seen it grow. But this wasn't growth. This was a crack in the surface. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, phone in hand. He wasn't done. At the station, the mood was business as usual. Officers joked at the front desk. A radio played low country music in the background. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. When Haley walked Margaret in, heads turned, not because she was a danger, but because she didn't belong there. Margaret walked with slow, steady steps, refusing to let the shame touch her. Her shoulders were still square, her gaze forward. "Who's the perp?" one young officer asked, looking up from a vending machine. Haley smirked. "Out-of-state driver, smart mouth, possible false ID. We'll book her and hold her until we confirm everything." The young officer raised an eyebrow. "She looks like she teaches third grade." Haley's eyes narrowed. "And I look like I ask for your opinion." Silence followed. Collins peeled off to the locker room, avoiding eye contact. He didn't like the way this felt, but he wasn't going to say anything. Not yet. Margaret was led to a holding room. It was clean, clinical, cold. They sat her down at a bench with a metal table. She looked at her reflection in the one-way mirror and took a breath. She had marched in Selma, had spoken at her husband's funeral just a week ago, and now here she was treated like a criminal in a town where she paid taxes, bought groceries, and waved politely to neighbors on her morning walks. Haley sat across from her and folded her arms. "Let's try this again. Name?" "Margaret Ellis," she replied evenly. "Address?" "Bean 32, West Pine, 2 blocks from where you stopped me." Haley wrote nothing down. She just stared. "You got a local driver's license?" "I applied for one. Oregon DMV's backed up. My Georgia license is valid." Haley leaned back in her chair. "You know, most people would be a little more cooperative." Margaret didn't flinch. "I've cooperated since the moment you pulled me over, but cooperation doesn't mean submission, officer." Haley's jaw tightened. "Why move here?" she asked suddenly. "To be near my son?" "What's he do?" Margaret paused just a beat. "City business." That answer wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't the truth Haley was looking for. Back in the holding room, Margaret shifted slightly on the cold bench. Her wrists still bore faint red marks from the handcuffs, but she ignored the sting. She'd lived through worse than humiliation, worse than arrogance wrapped in a badge. But something about tonight was different. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the bitter irony of being treated like a threat on the same week she buried the man who'd spent his life defending people from exactly this kind of abuse. She glanced toward the mirror again, imagining who might be on the other side. A rookie officer? A watch sergeant? Maybe no one. Maybe it was just her reflection now, dignified, but tired, not broken. Never that. In another corner of the station, Officer Miguel Torres leaned against the wall as the video ended. He had expected something routine, maybe even overblown, but what he saw was crystal clear. The woman hadn't resisted. She hadn't been rude. She hadn't raised her voice. He turned to Jim Hartley. "Do you mind if I copy this file?" "Hell, I was hoping you would," Jim said. "That woman didn't deserve any of it." Torres nodded, slipping the phone into a transfer dock. As the file uploaded, he felt the weight of it settle in his gut. This wasn't just an incident. This was a mess. A fire lit by ego and fueled by silence. And the department had been here before. Moments later, Torres found himself in front of Sergeant Daniels' office. Daniels was old-school grey-haired. No nonsense, always chewing gum like it was holding his jaw together. "I need you to see this," Torres said, placing the phone on the desk. Daniels watched, and, to his credit, He didn't speak until the video finished. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low sigh. "Done again?" he asked. Torres nodded. "And this one's bad." Daniels looked at the door, then at the phone, then back at Torres. "You realize if this gets out before we're ready, before Command reviews it, we're going to have a full-blown PR disaster?" "With respect, Sarge," Torres said, "we already do." Meanwhile, Haley returned to the holding room. Her expression was even more rigid now, as if trying to assert control through sheer posture. But Margaret wasn't impressed. "We'll be confirming your identity shortly," Haley said, offering nothing more. "I told you the truth," Margaret said, her tone even. Haley didn't respond. She just stepped out again. Margaret sat alone in silence. Then the phone rang, but not hers. Not the station line either. This was a private number 1 that rang directly in the office of Chief Raymond Halstead. The man answered groggily. "Halstead." The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, but unmistakably powerful. "This is Mayor Julian Ellis. My mother has been detained at your station. I want an immediate explanation." Halstead sat up straighter, his hand tightening around the receiver. "What? What name did you say?" "Margaret Ellis," Julian repeated. "I expect her released now." Halstead's pulse quickened. He knew that name, knew that voice, and within seconds, so would everyone else at the station. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was about to become front-page news. The clock on the wall of the Silver Creek Police Department ticked with a slow, steady rhythm. But inside Chief Raymond Halstead's office, everything felt like it was moving too fast. He barely hung up the phone, and already his stomach was in knots. Mayor Julian Ellis. That name wasn't just political. It carried weight, respect, fear, influence, and now fury. Halstead stared down at the receiver in his hand like it had burned him. Then he stood, fast and stiff, and marched out into the hallway. "Where's Officer Dunn?" he barked to the nearest desk sergeant. The sergeant blinked. "She's in the back, holding room 3. Halstead didn't wait for permission. His shoes pounded against the tile as he made his way to the back of the station. As he walked past the bullpen, conversations stopped. Officers glanced up from their desks. Everyone could feel the storm coming. In the holding area, Margaret still sat calmly at the table. Her hands rested in her lap. Her posture, despite the humiliating surroundings, was still regal. The door opened and Halstead stepped in. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. He paused, staring at her for just a second too long, and then cleared his throat. "Miss S. Ellis, I'm Chief Halstead. I'm going to resolve this immediately." Margaret tilted her head. "That would be appreciated." Halstead turned to the officer standing guard. "Get those cuffs off her, now!" The young man moved quickly, fumbling for his keys. "Has she been read her rights?" Halstead asked. "No, sir." "Good, because she shouldn't have been here in the first place." Margaret didn't smile. She simply nodded. As the cuffs came off, she slowly rubbed her wrists but said nothing. Meanwhile, out front, Officer Miguel Torres stood beside Sergeant Daniels, showing him the video again. Torres's expression was tight, restrained, like he was holding back everything he wanted to say. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "We need to log this formally." Torres looked him in the eye. "And we need to tell the chief. Now." Daniels nodded, exhaling. "You're right." At that moment, Halstead reappeared in the hallway with Margaret walking beside him. Every officer within sight straightened up, some out of surprise, some out of guilt. Halstead turned to Torres. "You, walk her to the front. Make sure she's comfortable while we prepare her release paperwork." Torres nodded. "Yes, sir." Margaret met his eyes. It was the first kind expression she'd seen all night. He walked with her slowly down the hall, away from the noise. In the front lobby, Jim Hartley was still pacing. He looked up as the doors opened and saw her upright, composed, free. "Ma'am," he said, stepping forward, "I saw the whole thing. I recorded it. You were treated horribly." Margaret looked at him for a moment and offered a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley." Jim Hartley. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley. Your voice might have made a difference tonight." Torres looked between them and said nothing, but something in his chest lifted. Back in the rear office, Halstead closed the door behind him and turned towards Sergeant Daniels. "Tell me everything." Daniels handed over the phone. "You'll want to watch this." Halstead watched in silence. The glow of the screen lit his face, first confused, then tight with dread. When it ended, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he placed the phone face down on the desk. She didn't resist. She didn't raise her voice. "No, sir," Daniels said. She was completely compliant, and Haley still cuffed her. "Yes, sir." Halstead's jaw clenched. "Where is Officer Dunn now?" "Locker room, I think. Bring her to my office. Now." In the locker room, Haley was halfway through changing out of her uniform when the call came through. She frowned at the text. "Chief wants you in his office. Now." She rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath, and threw her jacket back on. When she walked in, Halstead didn't waste time. "Sit." Haley crossed her arms. "What's this about?" "You detained Margaret Ellis?" "Yes, sir." She was non-compliant, evasive. "You arrested the mother of the mayor of Silver Creek." Haley's arms dropped. Halstead's voice was low now. "Dangerous. Did you even ask for ID? Did you verify anything before you cuffed a grieving woman outside her own home?" Haley opened her mouth. She had out-of-state plates. She refused a vehicle search. That was enough cause. No, it wasn't. Halstead slammed his palm on the desk, and the sound echoed through the room. "You embarrassed this department. You racially profiled a black woman 2 blocks from her house. And worst of all, you did it on camera." Haley blinked. "Camera? Someone filmed the whole thing. It's already being copied and passed around by our own officers, and guess what? It's probably already online." Haley said nothing. Halstead leaned forward. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your weapon." "You're kidding me. I'm not." Haley's face turned red. "Because of some political pressure? Because you broke protocol? And because you put us in the middle of a scandal that could cost this town everything?" Reluctantly, she unfastened her belt. She placed the gun down slowly, then removed her badge. The sound it made as it hit the desk was sharp, cold. Julian Ellis strode into the lobby like a storm front, his coat still on, his tie loosened but not sloppy. His eyes scanned the room instantly. When he saw her, his expression broke just slightly from righteous fury into something more personal, more raw. "Mum," he breathed. Margaret stood slowly. "Julian." He was at her side in 2 long steps, wrapping his arms around her like the world might try to take her again if he let go. And for the first time since the handcuffs clicked, her eyes closed, just for a second, just long enough to take in the safety of her son's arms. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I promise." Julian didn't believe her, not entirely, but he nodded, his jaws set. "Not one more second here. Let's go." Torres stood as they passed, offering a silent nod to the mayor. Julian paused just long enough to meet his eyes. A subtle, shared acknowledgement. "Thank you." And then they were gone, the heavy glass doors swinging open into the cool night. Back inside, Halstead remained in his office, staring down at the badge on his desk. Haley Dunn was gone, but the mess she'd created was just beginning. He knew the mayor would speak. The community would rise up. Journalists would call, protesters might come, and every policy, every report, every unsanctioned stop in the last 2 years would be dragged into daylight. He exhaled slowly, rubbed his temples, and reached for the Internal Affairs hotline. It was going to be a long night, and tomorrow, longer. The next morning, Silver Creek was no longer quiet. By sunrise, the video had already hit local news. By mid-morning, it was national. Footage of Margaret Ellis, calm, composed, restrained, standing outside her car while Officer Haley Dunn barked orders and slapped cuffs on her wrist, played on every screen. News anchors called it disturbing. Civil rights attorneys called it predictable. But on social media, it had another name, Margaret Gate. Thousands of comments flooded in. Justice for Margaret began trending on every platform. People weren't just angry, they were outraged. Not just at what they saw in the video, but at what it meant. That even now in a town like Silver Creek, a well-dressed widow, the mother of a sitting mayor, could be treated like a threat. Mayor Julian Ellis stood behind a podium just after noon, flanked by his city attorney and 2 senior aides. His mother sat in the front row, calm but visibly worn from the night before. He didn't waste time. Last night, my mother, Margaret Ellis, was wrongfully detained and humiliated by one of our own police officers. She was racially profiled, mishandled, and stripped of her dignity in a moment that should never have happened. Not in this town, not in this century. Flashes from cameras filled the room. Julian continued, "I want to make this perfectly clear. This isn't just about my family. It's about every black mother who's ever been treated like a suspect in her own neighborhood. It's about accountability, and it starts today." His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt. Across town, Officer Haley Dunn sat in her apartment, blinds drawn. Her badge and weapon sat in a box on the kitchen counter. Her phone buzzed non-stop calls from reporters, texts from colleagues, a voicemail from her union rep. The footage looped on every channel. Each time she watched it, she told herself the same thing. I followed procedure. I didn't do anything wrong. But the pit in her stomach said otherwise. She clicked off the TV and walked into the looked at herself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she liked what she saw. At the station, the atmosphere was electric. Half the staff whispered about the video. The other half watched it over and over, debating whether Haley had crossed the line or just finally gotten caught. Officer Miguel Torres sat at his desk, quietly compiling everything he'd seen, heard, and witnessed the night before. He wasn't interested in debate. He was interested in truth. And the truth was damning. Chief Holstead had already received a formal letter from Internal Affairs. They were sending 2 investigators down by the end of the day. And that meant one thing. Everything was now under review. Every stop, every citation, every complaint. And at the center of it all, Haley Dunn. But there was more. Torres had begun digging into past reports, looking at traffic stops Haley had written up over the last year. And what he found wasn't just troubling, it was a pattern. Unnecessary escalations, charges that didn't stick, complaints from mostly black and Latino residents, many of them dismissed or redacted. Now, with the spotlight glaring, they wouldn't be ignored. And that was before he even checked the name that came up 3 separate times in different reports, Maria Lopez. A single mother with 2 kids, no criminal record. Stopped 3 times in 6 months, all by Officer Dunn. Torres picked up the phone and made a call. "Miss S. Lopez, my name is Officer Miguel Torres. I'd like to talk to you about an incident you had last fall." Meanwhile, Margaret Ellis sat on her porch, sipping tea. The sun was warm, but the air still carried the chill of what had happened. Reporters were camped down the block, respectful but relentless. She'd received dozens of calls, old friends, civil rights organizations, former students, but the only call that stuck with her came from a woman she didn't know, Maria Lopez. She'd simply said, "Thank you for not staying silent." Margaret had nodded slowly, holding the phone close to her chest for a long moment after the call ended. Because she knew what Maria meant. Because she, too, once had stayed silent, had taught her children to lower their heads, say yes, sir, and keep their hands in sight. But now she was done whispering. Now they all were. By mid-afternoon, City Hall phone lines were overwhelmed. Staffers answered calls in rapid-fire rhythm. Some callers demanded Officer Dunn's arrest. Others wanted the entire department defunded. A few callers, older voices laced with tears, just asked, "How is she? Is Margaret okay?" Outside the police station, protesters began gathering. Not the usual angry crowd with slogans and banners, but neighbours, teachers, retirees, people who'd known Margaret Ellis for decades. They lit candles. They held up printed stills from the video. And they stood in silence for 9 minutes. The time she spent handcuffed and humiliated, a young boy from the local high school handed out flyers that read, "Who polices the police?" At the same time, a live stream popped up on YouTube. The thumbnail read, "Silver Creek, the truth they don't want you to see." It featured not only the footage Jim Hartley recorded, but interviews with residents, Black, Latino and white, all with their own stories about being stopped, questioned or threatened by Officer Dunn. One clip showed Maria Lopez outside her modest apartment. She looked straight into the camera. "She pulled me over with my kids in the car," Maria said, "accused me of driving a stolen vehicle. I cried the whole way home, but nobody believed me." Until now, the video hit 50,000 views in under an hour. Back at her apartment, Haley sat frozen, watching it unfold on her screen. Every new testimonial made her denial crack a little deeper. She told herself it was politics, that people were piling on, that she'd been doing her job. But deep down, she knew better. She hadn't seen Margaret Ellis that night, not really. She'd seen a profile, a threat, a category. And now the world was seeing her not as a protector, but as the problem. Elsewhere in town, Pastor Daniel Monroe of Silver Creek's oldest church delivered an impromptu sermon on the courthouse steps. "We often hear, 'This is not who we are,'" he said, his voice ringing through the crowd. "But the truth is, this is who we've allowed ourselves to become. And until we face that truth, we cannot change it." The crowd murmured in agreement. Inside his office, Mayor Julian Ellis sat at his desk, fielding texts from senators, governors, even someone from the White House's Civil Rights Task Force. His mother's name had become a symbol, but to him she was still just Mum, the woman who packed his lunch, who marched with his father, who taught him to tie a tie and stand up straight when facing disrespect. He looked down at his statement, unfinished on the page. He scratched out the word incident. This wasn't an incident, it was a reckoning. He picked up the pen again and kept writing. Across town, Margaret stood in her living room, watching the footage for the first time. Not the clip Jim Hartley had sent, but the one someone else had taken. From a different angle, someone down the block. The video caught her voice as she asked calmly, "Is there a reason, officer?" And Haley's face tight with control, ready for confrontation. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. She paused the screen. The frame froze on her eyes. Still, calm, defiant. She didn't recognize that woman at first, but slowly she began to. And this time she didn't look away. She stood taller, and she pressed play. 2 days after the video of Margaret Ellis's arrest went viral, Silver Creek was no longer just a town. It had become a symbol. National news trucks lined the courthouse square. Anchors broadcast live under umbrellas as rain fell in soft sheets. Protesters, now in the hundreds, stood beneath ponchos and makeshift tents. They weren't just locals anymore. Activists had come from Portland, Seattle, even Chicago. At the center of it all, Margaret Ellis sat quietly in a town hall meeting room, waiting for the hearing to begin. It was the first emergency oversight committee hearing in Silver Creek's recent history. A panel of 5 city officials, 2 state observers, and 1 federal representative had been called to review Officer Haley Dunn's conduct and the police department's pattern of internal negligence. Margaret hadn't planned to speak, but after seeing the crowds, after hearing her neighbors chant her name outside City Hall, she knew silence was no longer an option. When her name was called, she stood. There was no microphone adjustment, no pre-written speech, just her. I was raised to believe that if you carry yourself with dignity, speak with kindness, and follow the law, you'll be safe. That night I learned that wasn't true. Not for me, not for women who look like me, not even 2 blocks from home. She paused. The room was silent. Officer Dunn didn't see a woman. She saw a problem. She saw a threat. And what's worse, she acted like she had every right to treat me that way because the system taught her she could. Flashes from the press cameras didn't faze her. "I'm not asking for pity," she said. "I'm asking for accountability. And if you think this ends with me, then you're not listening." The applause was quiet at first, then louder, then a full standing ovation. Outside, Julian Ellis stood with community leaders, watching the live stream from his phone. His mother had never run for office, never wanted the spotlight, but there she was, commanding it with more strength than any politician he'd ever met. Inside the police department, the mood had shifted from tense to unstable. Internal affairs had arrived, files were being pulled, officers were being interviewed behind closed doors, and whispers filled every hallway. A few officers cleaned out their desks preemptively. Others avoided eye contact with Torres, who now walked with the quiet authority of a man who had seen enough and refused to ignore it. He'd spoken with 3 residents so far, each with a nearly identical story. A stop that escalated without cause, a citation that didn't hold, a threat of arrest when they asked too many questions. Each one named the same officer, Haley Dunn. But Torres didn't stop at the surface. He filed formal recommendations to audit body cam footage, review every traffic stop logged under Dunn's badge number, and open the sealed complaints that had been mysteriously buried over the past year. And with each page he reviewed, a pattern grew clearer. The next hearing would focus on systemic failure, and Margaret Ellis would not be the only voice in the room. Later that afternoon, Mayor Julian Ellis returned to his office, flanked by 2 aides and a civil rights attorney dispatched from the state. They found him already reviewing new reports, ones that hadn't made it into the department's public record. It was worse than he thought. 10 sealed complaints, 7 involving minorities, 5 dismissed without investigation, all involving Officer Dunn. "What did she say in her defense?" the attorney asked. Julian didn't look up. "That she was following her instincts." He set the file down. Instincts don't erase policy. They don't override decency. Meanwhile, Torres sat in an interview room with an older black man named Earl Watkins. Earl had lived in Silver Creek for 40 years, never arrested, never caused a stir. But 3 months ago he was pulled over on his way home from fishing. She said, "I didn't signal," Earl explained. "I did." "She just didn't like the look of me in that truck," Torres asked gently. "Did she threaten you?" Earl nodded. "Said she could have the truck impounded. Said I was lucky she was in a good mood." Torres wrote every word. In another office, internal affairs investigator Dana Reese reviewed a log of body cam footage from the last 18 months. Hours of video, most of it routine. But Dunn stood out. In one clip, she told a young Latino driver, "You don't get to ask questions. You do what I say or I find something that puts you in cuffs." Reese turned to her colleague. "We're not dealing with a one-time lapse in judgment. This is a pattern, a system that protected her, enabled her, and probably more like her." As day turned to evening, Margaret returned home to find dozens of letters on her porch. Some were handwritten, others typed, all from strangers. One read, "I watched what happened to you, and I saw my mother in your eyes. Thank you for standing tall." Another simply said, "You reminded us what grace looks like." She brought them inside and sat at her kitchen table, reading each one as the light faded. And then came a knock. It was Maria Lopez. She stood awkwardly for a second, holding a small box. "I brought tamales. I just wanted to say thank you." Margaret smiled and opened the door wider. "Come in." 2 women, 2 generations, 2 survivors, sitting in a quiet kitchen in a town that was finally being forced to listen. Across the street, Jim Hartley recorded it all from his porch, not for views, not for headlines, but to remember. Because this was history now, and Silver Creek would never be the same. Later that night, Margaret sat on her porch alone, a soft blanket over her lap, and the quiet hum of cicadas in the background. Her tea had long gone cold, but she hadn't moved. She was thinking about what came next. Tomorrow she would speak again, not just for herself, but for Maria, for Earl, for every person who had ever felt small under flashing lights. And this time she wouldn't wait to be called. She would raise her hand, and they would listen. The second hearing began with tension so thick, even the seasoned reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This time the crowd had doubled. The room was packed, wall to wall, and the overflow had spilled into a courtyard where a massive screen broadcast the proceedings live. Folding chairs, coffee thermoses, umbrellas, children sitting on their parents' laps. Everyone was watching. Margaret Ellis was seated up front again, but this time she wasn't alone. To her left sat Maria Lopez, hands clasped tightly in her lap. To her right, Earl Watkins, wearing a faded navy blazer and the same stubborn dignity he'd carried through 4 decades of quiet endurance. The hearing opened with testimony from Officer Miguel Torres. When he stepped up to the microphone, the room hushed. "I joined this department to protect and serve," he began. "But what I saw these past 2 weeks, that's not protection and it's not service." He detailed the sealed complaints, the missing body cam footage, the citations that went nowhere. The system failed, he said, and it failed in silence. When he finished, there was no applause, just a long, heavy stillness that said more than any cheer could. Then came the residents. Maria Lopez stepped forward, her voice trembling at first. "She pulled me over in front of my children," Maria said, "told me to get out of the car, yelled at me when I asked why. My daughter still asks me why the police don't like us." Then Earl Watkins told his story. His voice didn't tremble. "It rang like a bell. I did what I was told, and I still got threatened. So what are the rest of us supposed to do?" The final witness was unexpected. It was Jim Hartley. He walked slowly to the microphone, his phone in his hand, ball cap tucked in the back pocket of his jeans. "I've lived in this town for 61 years, he said. "I've been a firefighter. I've pulled folks out of burning houses. I've coached Little League. And I've never seen anything that rattled me like that night." He held up the phone. "I recorded it because I knew if I didn't, no one would believe her. And I don't care what anyone says. That's not how we treat people here, not anymore." The silence after his words was thick with understanding. A moment later, the committee chair leaned into the mic. "We've heard the stories. We've reviewed the footage. Now it's time to take action." And with that, the hearing recessed for deliberation. Outside the hearing room, the town felt like it was holding its breath. More than just a crowd had gathered. Civil rights lawyers from across the state stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans, youth activists, local business owners, even a few off-duty officers, unsure whether to show support or shame. Local news aired interviews live from the lawn. One elderly woman said softly, "We've seen injustice before, but this time it's not going away." Inside, Margaret leaned over to Maria and gently squeezed her hand. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In a nearby hallway, Chief Halstead watched the stream alone, arms folded tightly. He hadn't spoken publicly since suspending Dunn. He knew his silence was costing him, but he also knew speak too soon, and it might cost the department more. He wasn't sure which way the wind was blowing anymore. He only knew it was blowing hard. Back in the hearing room, the doors swung open. The committee had returned. The chair, a tall black woman from the State Attorney General's office, adjusted her microphone. Based on the testimonies, the documentation presented by Officer Torres, and the volume of civilian complaints previously unacknowledged by this department, this oversight committee is recommending the following actions. She paused. You could have heard a pin drop. 1. Officer Haley Dunn is to be formally terminated and referred for criminal investigation regarding civil rights violations. A murmur rippled through the crowd. 2. An independent audit of the Silver Creek Police Department's internal affairs processes will be launched immediately, with access to all sealed disciplinary files going back 10 years. And then, 3. A civilian review board made up of local residents, appointed by the mayor's office and approved by the city council, will now oversee all complaints moving forward. This time, the crowd didn't murmur. They roared. Outside, the cheers spilled into the streets. Bells rang from the old church tower downtown. Children waved homemade signs. Cars honked in solidarity. And for the first time in a very long time, Silver Creek felt like it was changing. Julian Ellis, standing near the back of the room, bowed his head for a moment. He thought of his father, of the marches, of the speeches. Then he looked at his mother. Margaret sat still, not triumphant, not angry, just present. A quiet figure who had moved a mountain by refusing to shrink. And she wasn't finished yet. Because justice, real justice, wasn't just about consequences, it was about repair. It was about rebuilding what had been broken. And now, finally, that work could begin. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills of Silver Creek, Margaret walked alone through the community park. People stopped her along the path, young and old, white and black. Some offered quiet thanks. Others simply nodded, eyes full of something deeper than admiration, recognition, respect. She reached the small garden at the center of the park, where a bronze plaque read, "For those who fought without glory." It had been there since the 70s, funded by her husband's first civil rights case victory. She hadn't visited it in years. Tonight, she did. She sat on the bench beside it and looked up at the night sky. No cameras, no noise, just stars and silence. And in that silence, she finally let the weight fall off her shoulders. The shame, the fear, the years of walking carefully, gone. She thought of what the committee had said, about civilian review boards, about investigations. It was good, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Margaret Ellis had never planned to become a symbol, but now that she was, she intended to use it. And what she did next, she would do for every voice that was still afraid to speak. The fight wasn't over, but it had finally, truly begun. 3 weeks after the second hearing, The world outside Silver Creek had moved on. But inside the town, the storm had only started to settle. Haley Dunn was no longer Officer Dunn. She now faced a formal investigation by the state's Civil Rights Division, with charges that included unlawful detention, abuse of power, and racial profiling. Her attorney maintained she had followed protocol, but after the hearings, no one was buying it. The evidence was too clear, the video too damning, her silence too loud. She moved out of her apartment just days after losing her badge. Neighbors stopped waving, stores stopped smiling. The town she once patrolled no longer looked at her with familiarity, but with something close to disgust. On the other side of town, Margaret Ellis was in motion. She'd spent her days not in rest, but in work meeting with community leaders, organizing listening sessions, and creating what she quietly called her final chapter. But this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something permanent. One morning she stood in front of the old library, long closed, long forgotten, and announced something no one had expected. "We're opening the Ellis Center for Community Justice," she said into a cluster of named, not for me, but for the legacy of my husband, and every person who's ever been silenced in the shadow of injustice. The Ellis Center would serve as a hub for legal aid, civil rights education, youth mentorship, and police accountability research. It would be staffed by lawyers, volunteers, and students. It would be free and it would be loud. Mayor Julian Ellis stood behind his mother as she made the announcement. He said nothing at first, just watched her. She wasn't speaking like someone hurt. She was speaking like someone reborn. When his turn came, he stepped to the podium. "We don't need performative reform," Julian said. "We need infrastructure. We need permanent change, and my mother isn't just a survivor, she's a builder. And I intend to fund this with everything my office can legally offer." Cheers broke out from the crowd. The Ellis name, once whispered, was now shouted with pride, but not everyone was clapping. Across town, in a small diner where officers used to gather for lunch, a different kind of conversation was unfolding. Two officers leaned over their coffees. "You see what they're doing now?" "Yeah." Turning the town into a courtroom, one of them shook his head. "Used to be. We ran this place. Now we're scared to write a ticket." Neither noticed Torres sitting in the corner booth, listening, not taking notes, just remembering. Because even as Silver Creek changed, not everyone would come with it. Later that day, Torres walked into the former library, the future Ellis Center, and found Margaret seated at a folding table with architectural drawings spread before her. He smiled. "You really going through with this?" She didn't look up. "I already have." Torres nodded, then pulled a manila folder from under his arm. "Internal Affairs wants to talk to me again, this time about other officers, ones who look the other way." Margaret glanced up. "Will you speak?" He hesitated. "I want to, but it means losing friends, people the first trained with." Margaret placed her hand gently on the table. "If they were your friends, they'd be standing beside you." Torres looked away, his jaw tense. Then slowly, he nodded. In the courthouse basement, Haley sat across from her attorney, visibly thinner, paler than she had been just weeks ago. The woman who once strutted through Silver Creek with a badge on her hip now looked like she barely recognized herself. "They're going to offer a deal," her lawyer said. "Probation, mandatory bias training, community service at the Ellis Center." Haley blinked. "They want me to work for her?" The lawyer sighed, symbolic gesture. "Optics." Haley shook her head. "I'm not a villain." "You're not the hero either," the lawyer replied softly. Outside, journalists waited near the courthouse steps. Every update, every development had become fuel for a larger conversation across the country. Towns similar to Silver Creek were now holding emergency council meetings. Video footage from other traffic stops resurfaced. Hashtags multiplied. National lawmakers took interest, and in the middle of it all was Margaret. She appeared on a Sunday morning political show seated beside Julian. When asked what had changed since her arrest, she didn't talk about the handcuffs or the cold bench in holding, or even Haley. She said simply, "I no longer walk quietly." That clip went viral. Later that week, she met with two senators behind closed doors. One proposed using the Ellis Center model for rural communities nationwide. Another asked her to speak at a civil liberties conference in D.C. Margaret said yes to neither and no to none. "I didn't build this for stages," she said. "I built it for sidewalks." That night, a vigil was held in front of the center's foundation. Candles, lit songs, sung go as stories told. Margaret stood at the steps, surrounded by elders and teens, ministers and mothers, officers and organizers. She didn't speak long. She just said, "This isn't the end of a and in Silver Creek." History kept turning its pages. Weeks later, the Ellis Center officially opened its doors. The line wrapped around the block. Local students volunteered as greeters. Former prosecutors offered free consultations. And in a back room, Margaret led the very first community session, Knowing Your Rights. She stood in front of a group of high schoolers, her voice clear, her tone firm. "When you're pulled over," she said, "you don't owe fear. You owe yourself dignity. That starts with knowing what they can't take from you." One young girl raised her hand. "What if they don't care?" Margaret looked her straight in the eye. "Then you remember that we do." Outside, Julian stood by the front sign, his hand resting on the dedication plaque. His staff brought him proposals, funding requests, invitations. But for a moment, he just stood there. He thought of what it had cost, his mother's pain, the town's division, his own silence in the early days. But he also thought of what had come from it. Change, real change, one hard step at a time. Then, as the afternoon light began to fade, a car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a woman in civilian clothes, her hair tied back, her face thinner than before. Haley Dunn. She stood at the sidewalk holding a clipboard, not a badge. A volunteer coordinator approached her, surprised. "You're here to help?" Haley nodded. "I requested to be placed wherever I could listen more than I speak." Inside, Margaret finished her and stepped into the hall. She saw her. They locked eyes. Neither said a word, but neither looked away. And that maybe was a start. The work would take years, maybe generations. But in that small building, on that quiet street, the healing had begun. And Margaret Ellis, mother, teacher, widow, survivor, was no longer just the woman who was arrested. She was the woman who built something no one could tear down, not now, not ever. By the time fall rolled around, the leaves in Silver Creek had started to turn, but the momentum Margaret Ellis had sparked showed no sign of slowing. The Ellis Center was no longer just an idea or a symbol. It had become a living, breathing hub of activity. Every day, dozens of people walk through its doors, some seeking help, others offering it. Students interned in the research wing, compiling local data on traffic stops and police interactions. Retired teachers offered reading programs for children, while their parents met with legal advocates in nearby rooms. Margaret moved through the space like a lighthouse. She was never in one place too long, always checking in, always listening, not commanding, but guiding. Julian visited once a week, sometimes more. He no longer needed to speak when he arrived. His presence said enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Julian and Margaret sat together in the break room of the center. No cameras, no crowd. He took a sip of his tea and said, "Mom, it's bigger than us now." She smiled gently. It always was. That same week, a national magazine featured Margaret on its cover. The headline read, "The Woman Who Refused to Bow." Inside was a 10-page spread on the Ellis Center, complete with interviews, testimonials, and portraits of Margaret walking through the halls she helped build. The piece drew national praise but also new scrutiny. Cable news segments dissected every word she said. Some commentators hailed her as the conscience of a generation. Others accused her of turning tragedy into politics. A conservative blog claimed she was anti-police and setting dangerous precedent. Margaret read none of it, but Julian did. He stared at the television one night, fists clenched, watching a panel argue about whether his mother was a force for change or a divisive figure undermining law enforcement morale. He turned the TV off and called a press conference. The next morning, Julian stepped up to a podium outside the Ellis Centre, sunlight catching the edge of his glasses. "I've heard the chatter. I've read the headlines," he began. "Let me be clear. My mother is not anti-police. She is pro-accountability. There is a difference," he paused. "And if demanding respect, dignity, and equal treatment under the law makes you controversial, then controversy is long overdue." The crowd erupted in applause, but behind the scenes, tension was rising. At the police department, changes were underway. The Civilian Review Board had already opened investigations into 4 other officers. 2 were placed on administrative leave, 1 resigned, and the 4th officer, Mike Crenshaw, publicly pushed back. At a town council meeting, he stood up and declared, "We can't do our jobs if every action we take is second-guessed. This isn't reform, it's revenge." Margaret watched from the back row. She didn't respond, but her eyes narrowed. Later that night she told Torres, "You don't fix something by pretending it's not broken." Torres nodded. "They'll come after you next." "I know," she said. In response, she organized the town's first community truth session, a forum where residents and officers sat in the same room, shared stories, asked questions, and for once, listened. The first session drew 200 people, the second 300. By the third, even Crenshaw showed up, not to speak, just to sit and listen. Margaret saw him there. She said nothing, but she made sure he saw her nod once before stepping away. As the Ellis Centre gained national attention, offers poured in. Universities asked for her papers, documentarians requested interviews, politicians extended invites. Margaret declined most of them, until one came from the National Civil Rights Museum. They wanted to induct her into their Wall of Honor. Julian found her standing at the window when he told her. "They said they want to honor what you've done." Margaret turned slowly. "Then they should come see what we're still doing." He smiled. The night of the induction, she wore a deep navy suit and pearl earrings. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet. She waited, let the applause fade. Then she said, "I'm grateful, but I didn't come here to be praised. I came here to remind you this story isn't finished. It's not even halfway through." Outside, the stars were visible over Memphis. And in Silver Creek, a young girl named Tiana sat on the steps of the Ellis Center with a notebook in her lap. She wrote down a single sentence. "When I grow up, I want to build something like this." Then she closed the book and looked up at the sign above the doorway and smiled. A week later, Torres stood in the back hallway of the Ellis Center holding a resignation letter. He had been offered a promotion, a captain's badge, but accepting it meant staying silent during the state hearings coming up the next month. Testifying would mean forfeiting the job. He found Margaret in the upstairs reading room, helping a group of teenagers prepare a mock trial. She looked up when he entered, sensing the weight he carried. "Captain Torres?" she said gently. He shook his head. "Not if I do what I'm about to." She said nothing. He held out the letter. "I can't stay and be quiet. If they're going to clean this up, someone's got to tell the truth. She looked at the envelope but didn't take it. You sure? I've never been more sure. Then she smiled quietly, proudly. Then, don't hand that to me, she said. Hand it to the next young officer who asks why you left. He nodded. Across town, Julian sat alone in his office. A federal email opened on his laptop. It was an invitation to Washington, to sit on a task force for national police reform. His finger hovered over the mouse. Accept. Decline. He thought about Margaret, about Torres, about the girl on the steps with the notebook. Then he clicked. Accept. Later that evening, Margaret walked the garden path outside the centre, a slow pace, her fingertips brushing the lavender as she passed. And in the growing dusk, she whispered to herself, "It's working. Not perfectly, not quickly, but it was working." And for the first time in decades, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something they might actually reach, together. Winter came early to Silver Creek. Snow touched the rooftops like a soft apology, blanketing the town in quiet white. But inside the Ellis Center, the fires of change still burned. People kept coming. The rhythm of community work never slowed, not even as the year came to a close. One morning, as the sun struggled to rise through the grey clouds, Margaret Ellis stood in her office, looking out over the street below. She wore her husband's old cardigan, too big for her shoulders, but just right for the season. She watched a young boy shovel the steps in front of the center without being asked. That meant something. Behind her, Julian stepped into the room holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You're not going to sit down, are you?" he said, handing one over. "Not today," Margaret replied. "There's too much left to do." That same afternoon, a crowd gathered outside the Silver Creek courthouse. Reporters lined the sidewalks, microphones pointed at the steps, waiting for one final decision. The trial of Haley Dunn had come to a close. It wasn't just a local affair anymore. National media outlets streamed it live. Civil rights organizations sent observers. Even law students from nearby universities came to watch. The courtroom had been full every day. Dunn had pled not guilty. Her defense argued she was following departmental procedure under pressure, with no intent to discriminate. But the prosecution played the video again and again. They called Torres. They called Margaret. They called Maria Lopez and Earl Watkins, and even Jim Hartley. Each one told the truth. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. Guilty on 3 of the 4 counts, including civil rights violation and abuse of authority. She would not serve prison time, just probation, mandatory restitution, and 5 years of community service, including work with civil rights and victim support programs. Some called it justice, others called it mercy. Margaret called it a beginning. Outside the courthouse, when asked by a reporter how she felt, she simply said, "Held accountable." That's all I ever asked. Back at the Ellis Center that evening, candles flickered in the windows. Dozens of residents had come not to celebrate but to reflect. A community circle formed in the auditorium. No speeches, just shared words. A young woman stood up and said, "Because of this place, I stopped being afraid." Another, older, added, "Because of this place, I started speaking up." Later that night, as the snowfall thickened, Julian sat alone in his office, reading letters from mayors in other cities, asking for guidance on how to start something like the Ellis Center. He smiled to himself, then knocked gently on his mother's office door. She looked up. "How many this time?" "5 more cities," he said. "And a university in North Carolina wants to name their social justice library after you." Margaret laughed. "That's ridiculous. I'm not a scholar." "You changed history, Mum. They're just catching up." She looked down at the file in front of her, the one with blueprints for the community health annex they were planning to add in the spring. "No," she said softly, "we're just getting started." Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the warmth remained. The next morning, as the town dug out from a fresh coat of snow, a group of kids gathered at the Ellis Center steps. They weren't scheduled to be there. They had no appointment. They just came. Margaret watched them from her office window, a faint smile on her lips. She walked down, opened the front doors wide and said, "Come on in, let's get to work." And with that, the story that had started in the cold on a quiet suburban street came full circle. A woman wronged, a town awakened, a future rewritten by the hands of those who refused to stay silent. 10 years later, the Ellis Center had grown into something no one could have imagined. What started in a library now occupied 3 buildings with satellite branches in 4 neighboring towns. It had helped dismiss over 1,200 wrongful citations, expunged hundreds of juvenile records, and mentored more than 500 young people, many of whom had gone on to become lawyers, teachers, and city leaders. A documentary crew filmed its story for PBS. One of its early interns was now running for city council, and every year on the date of Margaret's arrest, the town gathered for Ellis Day, not to remember the injustice, but to honor the response. But on that particular day, quiet and bright, crisp with the first chill of fall, a new plaque was unveiled. It stood at the front of the garden, near the lavender path she used to walk. It read, "She stood, and so we followed." Inside the center, now adorned with a mural of interlocked hands, a group of students sat in a circle, listening to a speaker. It wasn't Margaret. It was Tiana, the little girl who once scribbled in a notebook on the center steps. Now grown, now leading. She told the room, Margaret didn't change the world by shouting. She changed it by refusing to step aside. This place, this movement, it belongs to all of us now. In the back row, Julian sat quietly watching. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photo of his mother, standing tall in front of that first vigil, face lit only by candlelight. He held it for a moment, then slipped it back inside. Outside, the sky darkened gently. The wind carried the sounds of laughter and conversation down the street. No sirens, no shouts, just life, just peace, just the future Margaret Ellis helped build. One quiet step at a time that evening, long after the lights had dimmed and the students had gone home, Margaret sat alone in her old corner office. Her hair had gone fully white, and her hands trembled slightly when she poured her tea. But her eyes, sharp as ever, still watched over the courtyard below like they always had. Julian entered quietly, carrying her scarf. "It's getting cold," he said. "I know," she whispered. He draped it over her shoulders, and they sat together for a long time without speaking. Finally, she turned to him. "I never wanted to lead anything." Julian nodded. "I know. I just wanted to be left alone, to grieve in peace. But sometimes peace comes only after the noise." He smiled faintly. "You gave us more than peace, Mom. You gave us direction." She nodded slowly, looking toward the stars through the window. "I just hope," she said softly, "they remember it was never about me." Julian took her hand. "They will, because now it's about all of us." And in the hush of that moment, as winter settled once more over Silver Creek, Margaret Ellis closed her eyes not to sleep, but to rest, finally knowing that the story she lived had become the movement they would carry forward. Together, always. In a world that often moves too fast and forgets too easily, The story of Margaret Ellis reminds us that real change doesn't come from anger alone. It comes from courage, from grace, and from choosing to stand when it would be easier to sit in silence. Margaret didn't chase the spotlight. She didn't ask to become a symbol. She simply refused to be broken. And by doing so, she became the spark that helped heal a fractured town. For those of us watching, especially our older generation, you know better than anyone that the fight for dignity is not new. You've marched, you've prayed, you've waited. But Margaret's journey reminds us it's never too late to take the next step, whether that means speaking up, mentoring someone younger, or just refusing to look away when something's wrong. It matters. It all matters. So if this story touched you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through or someone you've known, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with someone who still believes in decency. Subscribe for more stories that don't just entertain, but say something worth hearing. And remember, your voice doesn't lose power with age, it gains it. Because sometimes all it takes is one person choosing not to walk away for a whole community to rise.